His fiancée shoved the black maid down the grand staircase, then the maid rose holding her wedding VE. You need to hear this one. One moment changed everything that night. On the grandest staircase of the wealthiest family in New England, a bride-to-be shoved a black maid to the marble floor in front of 300 guests. Cameras were rolling. Champagne glasses froze mid-air. Nobody expected what happened next. Because when that maid rose to her feet, she wasn't holding her own pain. She was holding the bride's wedding veil, and a secret that would end the wedding of the year before it even began. Trust me, you won't forget this one. Hey everyone, welcome back. Before we dive in, tell me, where are you watching from today? Which country do you call home? Drop it in the comments. I always love seeing how far these stories travel. Today's story is one of the most emotional ones we've ever told, about a woman the world tried to overlook, a family built on secrets, and one single moment on a staircase that no amount of money could undo. Stay until the end, because what this maid does with what she's holding will change everything you think you know about power, dignity, and who really deserves to be believed. Let's get into it. Naomi Bishop had learned a long time ago that the people who ran the world rarely noticed the people who kept it running. She was 32 years old, and for the last 6 years she had worked as a housemaid at Ashcombe Manor, the sprawling cliffside estate belonging to the Cole family, the closest thing New England had to royalty. The Coles owned hotels in 11 countries, a shipping line, half the waterfront property in Newport, Rhode Island, and, if the local papers were to be believed, a piece of nearly everyone's mortgage in the tri-state area. Naomi owned none of that. What she owned was a small rented house 11 miles from the estate, a used Honda with a check engine light that never turned off, and an 8-year-old son named Elijah who believed, with the total confidence of childhood, that his mother worked in the castle. She didn't correct him. In a way, he wasn't wrong. Every morning at 5:40, Naomi drove the coastal road as the sun came up over the water, parked in the staff lot behind the hedges so her car wouldn't be seen from the main drive, and let herself in through the service entrance. She pressed linens. She polished silver that cost more than her car. She learned, the way all good staff learn, to become part of the furniture, present, useful, and invisible. It hadn't always felt like a small life. Before Ashcombe, Naomi had been 11 credits from a paralegal degree, working nights at a diner to pay for it, when her husband Marcus got sick. 2 years of hospital bills later, the degree was gone, Marcus was gone, and Naomi was a widow with a toddler and a mountain of debt. Ashcombe Manor had offered steady pay, health insurance, and, she would never say this part out loud, a strange, quiet dignity in the work itself. She was good at it. She took pride in rooms nobody else noticed were clean. What made Ashcombe different from other households, Naomi always said, was Eleanor Cole. Eleanor had been the family matriarch, Nathaniel Cole's mother, and for the 11 years she was alive after Naomi started, she had treated the staff less like furniture and more like people. She remembered birthdays. She asked about Elijah by name. Once, when Naomi's car broke down in a February storm, Eleanor had personally driven her home in a Bentley that smelled like church, apologizing the entire ride for not thinking to check on her sooner. Eleanor Cole had died 2 winters ago, and the manor had not felt the same since. Now the estate belonged to her son, 34-year-old Nathaniel Cole, a quiet, serious man who had inherited his mother's kindness but not, it seemed, her spine. Nathaniel ran the family's hotel empire with sharp precision, but at home, in the one place that should have been simplest, he seemed to fold like paper. Because 8 months ago, Nathaniel had gotten engaged to Vanessa Sinclair. Vanessa was 30 years old, blonde, magazine beautiful, the daughter of a Connecticut real estate family that had money but, as the Newport old guard liked to whisper behind champagne flutes, not that kind of money. She had swept into Nathaniel's life 18 months after his mother's funeral, when he was still raw with grief, and by all appearances had never left his side since. The staff had their opinions about Vanessa. They kept those opinions to themselves. Naomi had her own opinion, formed the very first week Vanessa moved into the East Wing to help plan the wedding. It was a small thing, the kind of thing that meant nothing on its own. Naomi had knocked to deliver fresh towels, and Vanessa, on the phone, had waved her in without looking up, continuing her call as if Naomi weren't a person standing 3 feet away. "No, the account's fine, I told you," Nobody checks that account, it's practically a rounding error to people like this. Vanessa had glanced up, seen Naomi, and ended the call so fast the phone nearly slipped from her hand. "Just leave those on the bed," she'd said, smiling too wide. "Thank you so much." Naomi had left the towels. She hadn't thought about the call again, not for months. But tonight was the rehearsal dinner. 300 guests were arriving at Ashcombe Manor to celebrate a wedding that was 1 week away. The grand staircase had been polished to a mirror shine, garlands of white roses wound down the marble banisters, and somewhere upstairs, Vanessa Sinclair was getting dressed in a gown that cost more than Naomi would earn in 4 years. Naomi had been assigned to the East Wing that night, Vanessa's wing. She had no idea, as she smoothed the last wrinkle from a guest bed and checked her watch, that in exactly 3 hours, she would be lying at the bottom of that staircase in front of everyone Nathaniel Cole had ever known. Or that what happened next would be the thing people in Newport talked about for years. The chandeliers came on at 7, and Ashcombe Manor turned into something out of a dream. Naomi moved through the halls with a tray of champagne, part of the small army of staff Vanessa had insisted on for the rehearsal dinner, nothing too extravagant, just enough to make an impression, Vanessa had told the events coordinator, which in Newport translated to $200,000 worth of flowers and a 12-piece orchestra. Guests filled the ballroom in tuxedos and gowns that shimmered under the light. Nathaniel stood near the fireplace in a charcoal suit, shaking hands, laughing at jokes that didn't quite reach his eyes. Naomi had known him, in the distant, one-sided way staff know their employers, for 6 years. She recognized the difference between his real smile and his company smile. Tonight, she hadn't seen the real one once. Vanessa, by contrast, glowed. She moved through the room like she'd been born to it, touching elbows, laughing at exactly the right volume, steering conversations toward her own upcoming magazine feature, Newport's Next Great Love Story, the headline would read. It was nearly 8 when Naomi went upstairs to retrieve a shawl Vanessa had asked for, and found herself, for the second time in 8 months, standing 3 feet from a phone call she wasn't supposed to hear. Vanessa's bedroom door was cracked open. Naomi raised her hand to knock and stopped, because Vanessa's voice, low, clipped, furious, carried through the gap. "You cannot be here tonight. Do you understand me? If Walter Cole sees you within a mile of this house, everything is over. I don't care what he thinks he's owed, that account was closed the day I said it would be, and if he opens his mouth at my wedding I will bury him." Naomi froze, shawl in hand. No, listen to me. Nathaniel doesn't check anything, he trusts me completely, that's the whole point, that's why this worked in the first place. A floorboard creaked under Naomi's shoe. The line went dead silent. Then, sharply, "I have to go." The door swung open before Naomi could step back, and Vanessa stood there in her rehearsal gown, blue eyes narrowing the instant she saw Naomi holding the shawl. "How long have you been standing there?" "I just arrived, Miss Sinclair. You asked for your shawl." Naomi kept her voice level, professional, the way 6 years of training had taught her. Vanessa studied her for a long moment, too long, before snatching the shawl from her hands. "Next time, knock and wait. Don't loiter outside my door." "Of course. I apologize." But as Naomi turned to leave, something on the writing desk near the door caught her eye, a manila folder, half open, papers spilling from the edge. Bank letterhead. A name that wasn't Vanessa Sinclair's. A wire transfer amount with more zeros than Naomi had ever seen outside of the manor's own household accounts. She didn't mean to read it. She only saw it for a second and a half, the way you see a license plate in traffic, not on purpose, just there. But it stayed with her the rest of the night, a splinter she couldn't stop touching. A different last name. A different account. Walter Cole, Nathaniel's 81-year-old grandfather, the family patriarch, still sharp as a blade despite his age, apparently owed something, or knowing something, that Vanessa was very determined he wouldn't say out loud tonight. Naomi told herself it wasn't her business. She had a son to raise and a job to keep, and women like her did not insert themselves into the affairs of women like Vanessa Sinclair. She carried her tray back downstairs, refilled glasses, smiled the polite, practiced smile of someone who had made herself professionally forgettable. But at 9:40 that night, as the toasts were beginning and Nathaniel stood at the top of the grand staircase to make an announcement to the room below, Naomi saw something that made the decision for her. Walter Cole had arrived. Uninvited, unannounced, standing in the foyer in his old wool coat, asking a confused junior staffer where he might find his grandson. And Vanessa Sinclair, glass of champagne halfway to her lips, had just seen him too. Everything after that happened fast, the kind of fast that only makes sense afterward, in pieces, like a shattered plate someone tries to reassemble on the floor. Naomi saw Vanessa's face change. Not fear, exactly, something colder and faster, a calculation running behind her eyes. Vanessa set down her glass, smoothed her gown, and began walking toward the foyer with the too bright smile of someone about to perform damage control. Naomi, without fully deciding to, followed. She told herself later it was instinct, the same instinct that made her check on Elijah when he went quiet in another room. Something was about to go wrong, and 6 years of reading this house's silences told her it was about to go wrong publicly. At the top of the grand staircase, where the wide marble steps curved down into the ballroom in full view of 300 guests, Vanessa reached Walter Cole first. Naomi, a few steps behind, close enough to hear, watched the old man's face, confused, then hardening, as Vanessa spoke to him in a low, urgent voice. "Not here, Walter, we agreed you would wait until." "I agreed to nothing," the old man said, louder than Vanessa wanted. "I came to speak with my grandson. Tonight." Nathaniel, hearing his own name from below, was already turning, already starting up the staircase toward them, a champagne flute still in his hand, his face open with the easy confusion of a man who has no idea his entire life is about to change. And Naomi, still holding the folded shawl Vanessa had discarded on the hall table, the manila folder's contents burning in her memory, made a choice. "Mr. Cole," she said quietly to Nathaniel as he reached the landing, "there's something you should." She never finished the sentence. Vanessa turned, saw Naomi standing there, saw the shawl, saw the look on Naomi's face that must have told her, correctly, that this maid had read exactly what was in that folder and was about to say so in front of Nathaniel and his grandfather both. "Get away from him," Vanessa snapped, low and vicious, and shoved Naomi with both hands. It wasn't a small push. Later, 3 separate phone videos would confirm exactly how hard it was, hard enough that Naomi's feet left the marble entirely, hard enough that she had no time to grab the banister, no time to do anything but reach out instinctively for the nearest solid thing in her collapsing world. That solid thing was Vanessa's veil, pinned into her hair for the rehearsal photos, trailing 6 feet down her back. Naomi's hand closed around the lace and pulled it free as she fell. The room did not gasp all at once. It happened in a wave, the nearest guests first, seeing a woman in a maid's uniform tumbling down 12 marble steps, then the wave spreading backward through the crowd as more heads turned, more phones came up, more voices rose into a single collective sound of 300 people watching something happen that could never be happened. Naomi hit the bottom step hard, her wrist twisting beneath her, pain exploding white and total up her arm. The ballroom had gone eerily quiet except for the orchestra, which, in the surreal way disasters sometimes unfold, kept playing for 4 full seconds before someone finally signaled them to stop. Nathaniel was already moving, already shouting her name, not Vanessa's. Naomi's. And Naomi, dazed, her wrist screaming, her elbow bleeding onto the white marble, pushed herself up onto her knees in front of the entire wedding party of Newport's golden couple. She was still holding the veil. The delicate lace hung from her fist, torn free at the comb, and for one endless, silent moment, every camera in that ballroom was pointed not at the bride at the top of the stairs, but at the maid at the bottom, rising slowly to her feet with the missing piece of Vanessa Sinclair's wedding, and, though nobody but Naomi knew it yet, the missing piece of the truth, clutched in her bleeding hand. For 3 full seconds, nobody in the ballroom moved. Then everything moved at once. Nathaniel reached Naomi first, taking the stairs 2 at a time, dropping to his knees beside her on the cold marble without a single thought for his tailored suit. "Don't move, Naomi, don't move. Are you hurt? Someone call an ambulance." "I'm fine," Naomi said, though the words came out thin, her voice shaking with adrenaline. Her wrist was already swelling, an angry purple blooming beneath the skin. "I'm okay, Mr. Cole, please." "You are not okay. You just fell down 12 stairs." He turned, furious, toward the top of the staircase, where Vanessa stood frozen. One hand pressed to her chest in an expression Naomi would later think had been rehearsed for exactly this kind of audience. "What happened? Vanessa, what happened?" Vanessa's voice cracked, perfectly, theatrically. "Nathaniel, I don't know what came over her. She grabbed my veil. I think she tripped and grabbed for something to catch herself, and I tried to help her and—" "That's not what I saw." The voice came from the crowd, a guest near the base of the stairs, an older woman Naomi vaguely recognized as a friend of Eleanor Cole's from the Historical Society. "I was standing right here." That young woman pushed her. "With both hands." "I saw it too." A second voice. Then a third. And then, worse for Vanessa than any single eyewitness, a phone, held up by a groomsman near the foyer who'd been filming the toast for his own social media, its screen replaying in slow motion for the small cluster of guests around him. Vanessa's hands, flat against Naomi's shoulders, pushing. Nathaniel's face, when he looked at that phone, changed in a way Naomi had never seen in 6 years of quiet, invisible service. Walter Cole, standing at the top of the stairs with his cane and his old wool coat, said nothing at all. He simply watched his grandson's face and, for the first time that night, allowed himself something close to a small, grim satisfaction. The look of a man who has been waiting a long time for the truth to finally show itself. Naomi, still on the floor, still holding the torn veil, felt the weight of every eye in the ballroom and understood, with sudden clarity, that this was the moment her ordinary, invisible life ended. Whatever happened next, whether she was fired on the spot, whether Vanessa's version won out despite the video, whether Nathaniel Cole believed a maid over his own fiancée, nothing about tomorrow would look like yesterday. "I need a doctor over here," Nathaniel said, his voice tight, not looking away from Naomi. "Now. And somebody get me that folder." Naomi's breath caught. "The folder," Nathaniel said again, turning finally to look at her, something desperate and searching in his expression, as if he already sensed that the answer to tonight's chaos wasn't only on the staircase, but in whatever Naomi had been about to tell him before Vanessa's hands found her shoulders. "You said there was something I should know." "What folder, Naomi?" Behind him, halfway up the staircase, Vanessa's composure finally, visibly cracked. "Nathaniel, don't," she said, and for the first time all night, her voice wasn't performing for anyone. "Please. Not here." They moved the whole scene into Nathaniel's private study, Naomi with an ice pack pressed to her swollen wrist, refusing the hospital until after, Nathaniel pacing, Walter Cole settled into a leather chair with the stillness of a man who had waited 81 years to be patient about something. Vanessa was not in the room. She'd been asked, with unusual coldness, to wait in the East Wing. "Start from the beginning," Nathaniel said to Naomi, crouching so he was eye level with her instead of standing over her. "Please. Whatever it is." Naomi hesitated. 6 years of training told her to stay silent, to protect her job, to remember that whatever happened between the Coles and Vanessa Sinclair was not her fight and never had been. But she thought of Eleanor Cole driving her home in the snow. She thought of Elijah, waiting for her at home, believing his mother worked in a castle where good people did the right thing. So she told them. The phone call 8 months ago. Nothing checks that account. People like this. Tonight's call, the wire, the closed account, Walter Cole's name spoken like a threat. The folder on the desk, glimpsed for barely 2 seconds, a different last name on the bank letterhead, an amount too large to be anything but significant. Walter Cole's face, as she spoke, went very still. "What name?" he said quietly. "On the letterhead. Do you remember it?" Naomi closed her eyes, trying to pull the fragment back into focus. Something like, Renshaw. Vanessa Renshaw. The old man exhaled slowly, and something in his shoulders sagged. Not surprise, Naomi realized. Confirmation. Renshaw was her name before Sinclair, Walter said. Before her mother remarried. I've had a man looking into her for 4 months, Nathaniel. I didn't want to say anything until I was certain, because I know how it would have sounded, a jealous old man trying to break up his grandson's engagement. But 4 months ago, a woman calling herself Vanessa Renshaw opened a shell account tied to the Ashcombe Historical Preservation Trust. Your mother's charity, Nathaniel. The one that funds the children's wing at Newport General in her name. Nathaniel's face had gone pale. That's not possible. Vanessa runs that trust's fundraising committee. She runs it, Walter said, which is precisely how she's been quietly rerouting 11% of its donations into a personal account for the last year and a half. I have the transfer records. I've had them for weeks. I was waiting for proof strong enough that you couldn't dismiss it as an old man's paranoia, and tonight, apparently, a woman with far less power in this house than I have found the proof for me, and nearly got killed on your staircase for the trouble. Naomi felt the room tilt slightly. She hadn't imagined, even for a second, that what she'd glimpsed on that desk touched something as large as Eleanor Cole's own memorial charity. Money meant for sick children, quietly siphoned by the woman about to become Eleanor's daughter-in-law. Nathaniel sat down heavily in the chair across from his grandfather, staring at nothing. She's been stealing from my mother's charity. Among other things, I suspect, Walter said. But that's the piece I could prove. Nathaniel turned to Naomi, and something in his expression, grief, gratitude, guilt, all tangled together, made her look away, uncomfortable with how closely he was watching her. You could have said nothing, he said quietly. You could have kept your head down and let the wedding happen, and none of this would have touched you. I thought about it, Naomi admitted, honestly, because there was no point lying now. For about 2 seconds. And then I thought about your mother. Nathaniel's jaw tightened, his eyes suddenly bright. He didn't say anything else for a long moment. Naomi spent that night in the emergency room after all, her wrist confirmed sprained, not broken, her elbow stitched where it had split open on the marble. Nathaniel had insisted on driving her himself, over her protests, sitting in the hospital waiting room in his rehearsal dinner suit at 1 a.m. like a man who had nowhere more important to be. You should go home, Mr. Cole, Naomi told him, exhausted, her arm in a temporary splint. You have 300 guests who watched your fiancé shove your housekeeper down a staircase. I imagine there are calls to make. There are, he agreed. But none of them are more important than making sure you're okay. My family owes you that much, at minimum. Naomi didn't know what to say to that, so she said nothing. She didn't go into work the next day. Nathaniel had personally insisted she take paid leave, as long as you need, which felt both kind and faintly terrifying, the particular vertigo of being noticed after years of trying not to be. She spent the day at home instead, wrist elevated on a pillow, Elijah bringing her cups of water with the serious concentration of an 8-year-old playing nurse, asking every 20 minutes if the castle people had called yet. They had, actually. Several times. Not Vanessa. Naomi never heard from Vanessa again, but the family's attorney, gently, carefully confirming that Naomi's medical bills would be covered in full and that no, she would not be expected to return to work until she felt ready. What Naomi didn't know, sitting in her small living room with her son curled against her side, was that 70 minutes away, at Ashcombe Manor, the last 24 hours had detonated the entire Cole Sinclair engagement in a manner far more thorough than a single staircase shove ever could. Walter Cole's private investigator had spent the morning compiling everything he'd gathered over 4 months into a single binder, and by noon, Nathaniel and his family's attorneys had confirmed what the old man suspected. The shell account tied to the Ashcombe Historical Preservation Trust wasn't Vanessa's only irregularity. There was also a payment history connecting her to a man in Providence, the same man Walter had apparently interrupted the rehearsal dinner to confront her about. A man she'd been quietly engaged to, under a different surname, 18 months before she ever met Nathaniel Cole. An engagement, records suggested, that had never technically been called off, only paused. Convenient, given what it would have made her, a woman quietly maintaining 2 engagements while embezzling from a dead woman's children's charity in between. The Newport rumor mill, usually content with gossip about affairs and prenups, had never seen anything quite like it. By that evening, 3 separate news outlets had picked up grainy footage of the Ashcombe staircase incident, and the caption writing itself online was some version of the same sentence. A maid was pushed down the stairs for grabbing a wedding veil, and what she was holding turned out to matter a lot more than the veil itself. The story broke wide open 4 days later, and it broke because of a decision Nathaniel Cole made that surprised almost everyone who knew him. Instead of quietly settling everything behind closed doors, the traditional Cole family method for handling anything embarrassing, honed over 4 generations of old money, Nathaniel called a press conference. He stood, alone, in front of the same grand staircase, cameras arranged at the base of the same marble steps where Naomi had fallen 5 days earlier. Newport's social elite, half of whom had witnessed the incident firsthand, watched from their televisions with a kind of hungry fascination usually reserved for royal scandals. 5 days ago, Nathaniel said, his voice steady despite the visible tension in his jaw, a member of my household staff was physically assaulted in this house by my fiancé, in front of 300 witnesses, for trying to bring forward evidence that my fiancé had been stealing from a charity established in my late mother's memory, a charity that funds pediatric care at Newport General Hospital. He let that settle before continuing. Vanessa Sinclair is no longer welcome in this family, in this house, or in my life. Charges related to the embezzlement have been filed and are now in the hands of the district attorney's office. I won't be taking questions about the legal specifics tonight, out of respect for that process. A reporter shouted a question about the engagement. Nathaniel answered it anyway. There is no wedding, he said simply. There never should have been one. Then he said the thing that would end up, days later, quoted in 3 different major newspapers and clipped into 100,000 video reposts. What I want people to understand is this. The truth in this house didn't come from private investigators or lawyers or from my own family, though we were pursuing it. It came from a woman who had every reason to stay quiet. Naomi Bishop has worked in this house for 6 years. She has never once been anything but honest, careful, and kind, to my mother, to my staff, to my family, and, as it turns out, to me, even when telling me the truth meant risking her own safety and her own job. My mother believed that the measure of a household isn't the family whose name is on the deed. It's the people who show up every day and do right by each other, whether anyone's watching or not. Naomi Bishop showed up. I am deeply, permanently grateful to her, and deeply ashamed it took a woman getting shoved down my staircase for the rest of us to see what should have been obvious all along. Watching the clip later that night on her phone, propped up in bed with her sprained wrist still wrapped, Naomi cried for the first time since the fall, not from pain, but from something closer to relief, the release of 6 years of being careful, invisible, small. Elijah, half asleep beside her, mumbled, "Is that the castle man?" "Yeah, baby," Naomi said, wiping her eyes. "That's the castle man." The days that followed felt, to Naomi, like watching her own life from slightly outside it. Reporters found her small rented house within 48 hours of the press conference, and Naomi, with the calm, guarded instincts of a woman who had spent years being professionally invisible, declined every interview request except one, a short, careful statement she gave from her front porch, Elijah's hand held tightly in hers. "I did what anyone should do," she told the small cluster of cameras. "I'm not a hero. I just told the truth when it mattered, and I got hurt for it, and I'm glad it's over. That's all I want to say." It wasn't all Nathaniel wanted to say, however. 10 days after the incident, he drove out to Naomi's house himself. No driver, no assistant, just Nathaniel Cole standing awkwardly on her small front step in jeans and a plain jacket, looking, for the first time since Naomi had known him, like an ordinary man instead of the heir to an empire. "I wanted to apologize properly," he said, when Naomi opened the door, startled. "Not through a lawyer." Not through a check. In person. Naomi, unsure what to do with a billionaire standing on her porch, invited him in for coffee, mostly because she couldn't think of what else to do. They sat at her small kitchen table, the same table where Elijah did his homework every night, and Nathaniel told her things he apparently hadn't said to anyone else. That he'd known, somewhere underneath the grief of losing his mother, that something about Vanessa had never quite fit. That he'd ignored it because grief made him desperate for anything that felt like stability. That his grandfather had tried to warn him for months and he'd dismissed it as an old man's stubbornness. That watching Naomi fall down those stairs, and watching her rise holding that veil, had been the moment the fog finally, brutally cleared. "You lost 6 days of pay you couldn't really afford to lose," Nathaniel said. "You risked a job you needed. You could have just handed me that towel and walked away that first night, months ago, and none of this would have touched you. I keep thinking about that. Why didn't you just walk away?" Naomi thought about it honestly before answering. "Because your mother never would have let something like that slide, and she was kind to me when she didn't have to be. I guess I wanted to be the kind of person who deserved that kindness. Even if nobody ever knew." Nathaniel was quiet for a long moment, looking down at his coffee. "My mother used to say the same thing, almost word for word," he said finally. "About your mother, actually. Ruth. She said Ruth Bishop was the most honest woman she ever employed, and that if she was ever in trouble, Ruth would be the first person to tell her the truth, whether she wanted to hear it or not." Naomi went very still. "You remember my mother?" "My mother talked about her for years after she passed," Nathaniel said gently. "I think that's part of why I trusted you as much as I did, that first week you started working here. I didn't even realize it consciously until just now." For the first time since the staircase, Naomi felt something in her chest unknot completely. The weeks that followed brought consequences neither Naomi nor anyone at Ashcombe Manor could have fully predicted. Vanessa Sinclair, or Renshaw, depending on which version of her past you believed, pled guilty to embezzlement charges related to the Ashcombe Historical Preservation Trust 3 months later, in a quiet courtroom far from any cameras, having accepted a plea deal that included restitution and probation. The Providence engagement, it turned out, had indeed still been active. That man, too, had apparently been unaware he was one of two. Newport society, never short on opinions, largely agreed she would not be welcome at another society event north of Connecticut for a very long time. Naomi returned to work at Ashcombe Manor 6 weeks after the incident, her wrist fully healed, though the estate she returned to looked, felt, and functioned differently than the one she'd left. Nathaniel had made changes. Structural ones, not just personal ones. He'd established a formal grievance process for staff, something the family had somehow gone 4 generations without. He'd raised the pay for every household employee by 20%, calling it, simply, overdue. And he'd asked Naomi, specifically, if she would be willing to take on a newly created role, estate operations director, overseeing not just her own work but the well-being of the entire household staff, with a salary that would, for the first time in her adult life, let her breathe. "You don't have to say yes," Nathaniel told her, sitting across from her in his study, the same room where the truth had first come out. "But I've watched you run half of this house quietly and correctly for 6 years without anyone noticing or thanking you for it. I'd like to actually pay you for the job you were already doing." Naomi said yes. She also, at Walter Cole's quiet insistence, accepted something else, a scholarship fund the old man personally set up, covering the remainder of the paralegal degree Naomi had abandoned 9 years earlier when Marcus got sick. "Consider it overdue interest," Walter told her gruffly, in the closest thing to warmth Naomi had ever heard from him, on 6 years of honesty this family didn't earn and didn't deserve, but got anyway. Elijah, for his part, was delighted mostly by the fact that his mother now had an office in the castle, a detail he shared with his entire 3rd grade class during show and tell, complete with a photograph of the grand staircase, which he described, with total sincerity, as the stairs where my mom was a hero. Naomi never quite thought of herself that way. but she stopped correcting him. A year passed. Naomi Bishop sat in the front row of a small graduation ceremony at a community college outside Newport, her paralegal certificate finally, officially in hand, 9 years after she'd first started the coursework in a life that felt like it belonged to someone else. Elijah, 9 now, sat beside her in his good shirt, clapping so hard his hands turned pink. 2 rows back, in a suit that had clearly been chosen to be unremarkable and failed anyway, sat Nathaniel Cole, who had insisted on coming, as a friend of the family, which by now was simply true. The grand staircase at Ashcombe Manor had been repainted since the incident, not because anything was wrong with it, but because Nathaniel said he wanted the house to feel like it was moving forward, not standing frozen in the moment everything changed. A small brass plaque had been added at the base of the stairs, easy to miss unless you were looking for it, engraved with a single line. In this house, the truth is always welcome, no matter who carries it in. Naomi still worked at Ashcombe, though her role had grown twice more since that first promotion. She now oversaw not just the household but a small charitable initiative Nathaniel had launched in his mother's name, one that specifically funded continuing education for working parents like the woman she used to be. She had personally approved 11 scholarships in its first year alone. She thought about that night on the staircase often, not with pain anymore, but with a strange, settled gratitude. She hadn't fallen down those stairs because she was brave. She had fallen because she told the truth in a house built, quietly, on people who usually didn't. And she had risen, veil in hand, not because she wanted to be seen, but because standing back up was simply the only thing left to do. If there was a lesson in it, and by now, thousands of strangers online had told her, in comments and messages and the occasional tearful stranger stopping her at the grocery store, that it wasn't really about wealth, or class, or even about the particular cruelty of that shove on the stairs. It was smaller than that, and bigger than that, both at once. It was that dignity doesn't ask permission from money. That the truth doesn't check your job title before it decides to matter. And that sometimes, the person everyone else has trained themselves not to see is the only one in the room brave enough to say the thing that needed saying. Naomi Bishop never set out to be anyone's inspiration. She just refused, on one ordinary Tuesday night, to stay quiet in a room full of people who'd gotten very good at pretending not to notice what was really going on around them. And that, in the end, was the whole story. If this story moved you even a little, go ahead and hit that like button. It genuinely helps this story reach more people who need to hear it. Subscribe to the channel if you're new, because we bring you a story just like this one every single week. And if someone in your life needs a reminder that honesty and quiet courage still matter, go ahead and share this with them. Thank you for staying until the very end. I'll see you in the next story.